Now we are ready. Dear ambassadors, mediation experts, colleagues, and friends. I have the great honor today to welcome you again on behalf of the Women Peace Mediator Network Germany and its members to our today's tête-à-tête. Before we jump into substance, I would like to take... Sorry for that. Before we jump into substance, we would like to take chance to give you a little overview of what has been taking place and done since a year, because by now we are officially operating since 1 year already. We ourselves are actually positively surprised at what we have already been able to achieve in our first year of existence. So let me share with you just the most significant developments. First of all, we grew in members. And even more important to mention is that our new members revealed how many top experienced German women we have that are involved in daily mediation work at a rather higher political level. Second, we, the members of the WPM network, represent a wide range of thematic and geographic peacemaking expertise. Already in our first year of operation, people reached out to us just as we had hoped. They have used our list of members on our homepage to use us as a resource to inquire specific mediation expertise, maybe for briefings on specific matters of women inclusion in peace processes, for example. In this regard, diplomats and politicians have additionally reverted to us in their efforts to integrate women more strongly in peace processes and subject-related relevant events. So we have actively participated in the debate on the development of the guidelines of Germany's foreign feminist policy. Here we have made suggestions on how mediation expertise can be better incorporated into peace processes. And you may remember the WPM network stands for 2 objectives: an increase in the selection of women as mediators for track 1 peace processes, and the recognition that methodological mediation expertise alongside political experience is an essential component of competence of lead mediators in track 1 peace processes. So fourthly, and last but not least, we have managed to realize our vision of providing women peace mediators a safe space for professional exchange. Our meetings, our internal meetings, serve as a space for giving and taking advice and support to each other on very specific professional questions and challenges in the mediation processes we are engaged in on a daily basis. As such, I would say we also have become a learning network. So today, we will have the second WPM network tête-à-tête. And before my colleague and member of the network, Katrin Quesada, introduces you to our excellent guests and the specific format of their conversation, I'm very pleased to hand over to another colleague and member of the WPM network, Ms. Barbara Einhäuser. As you have probably realized by now, each of our tête-à-têtes include the personal presentation of one of our members. We give you a sample, so to say. So last time we heard of Dr. Katrin Wittig from Mali, and today, please welcome with me Barbara Einhäuser from Brussels. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for giving me the floor, and einen schönen guten Nachmittag, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where we're reaching you right now. My name is Barbara Einhäuser, and I've joined the Women Peace Mediators Germany network last year. I currently work in the European Commission in Brussels on mediation and also on crisis response in the Horn of Africa. And working in the European Commission, my work in the past years has really been on to support mediation processes led by other actors, be it through capacity building, financial support, logistical support, or of course by and with the many colleagues we have in EU delegations worldwide, by trying to connect the different levels of mediation from the grassroots to the highest political levels. A lot of my work also has involved deploying rapid and short-term technical and mediation expertise to mediation processes worldwide. And this has really been a very large area of expertise, ranging from process design expertise, from expertise on national dialogue, or mediating land and water conflicts. And throughout and over these past years, there is really an increased recognition of mediation expertise in peace processes. And you may be aware that this is also really a goal of this network. So this, also really my daily work brought me to this network on a daily basis with our partners. I have to ask whether there is a gender-sensitive conflict analysis, whether the process design that we support promotes gender equality and enables inclusivity more generally, and really on a daily basis seeing together how we can do better. How can we better provide women mediators with the opportunities, with the exposure, with the political backing, and where needed also with the resources and the capacity building. And you know that the advocacy is a key element to the network here, and the necessity really for men and women alike to continue to push for more women mediators, for more women chief negotiators and political representatives. And as I said, in my current work, I really look on a daily basis often for expertise, the right expertise for specific contexts and topics, mainly at track 1 and track 2 processes. So from my perspective, of course, when it comes to finding and pushing this expertise, networks cannot really be large enough. And I'm also very happy that we're in touch with a lot of the other women mediators networks out there as well. Like Christina said, on a personal level, obviously, the network also is a lot of peer support. It's an opportunity to exchange. And of course, it's also just really inspiring to exchange with women who have the expertise, but also the creativity and the resilience to help conflict parties overcome their differences and arrive at just and workable solutions. And I'm therefore very, very happy to hand over to one of these women, my colleague Katrin Quesada, who has herself a lot of expertise in supporting the EU in conflict prevention and mediation, and who has also worked a lot on human rights and security sector reform in the Western Balkans and North Africa. And over to you, Katrin.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Also from me, good afternoon and good morning. It's morning for me here. We're very, very pleased to have all of you viewers, and we're particularly excited and honored, really to say, to have two very distinguished guests for today's conversation, which is called System Rivalries, Military Interventions and Sanctions. Where's the space for mediation? And we have with us Ambassador Gesa Bräutigam, who has been working on security policy from different angles for many, many years. She was one of the first ones dealing actually with the European Security and Defense Cooperation when this was a very, very new topic. She has worked on it from many different angles. She's been in the cabinet of the foreign minister, in the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. She has a very long career being a German diplomat and is currently the head of the German permanent mission to the OSCE in Vienna. So very grateful to have her here with us today and share a little bit of her insights from the past years. We also have with us Theresa Whitfield, who many of you, all of you, I would say, who work around mediation, of course, know. She has started her career as a journalist, very locally working on overcoming conflict, has devoted really most of her career to overcoming conflict in Latin America first, and then many, many years for the UN in different functions. Most recently, she's been the director of the Policy and Mediation Division of the UNDPPA in New York, which of course was on the forefront really of supporting peace processes all over the world. So warm welcome to both of our guests. We're really, really excited to have you here. Maybe just a quick word on the format. We, as you've seen probably from our launching event, if you participated, we very much enjoy giving two senior women the space to exchange quite freely and drawing on their experience. And I think what we're interested in today is particularly looking to some extent into the topic around the space for mediation in the current context, but also seeing how you have drawn from your own experience, being not only an expert in the topic, but also a woman in what you do. So there will be a free conversation between you. There are no comments or questions. You had a couple of guiding questions beforehand. And so your conversation will last about 30 minutes. And I will come back in later to just highlight a few points. Maybe just a brief word on the topic for today. Why did we choose that? Why did we look at this topic of system rivalries? And I think we have noticed since the establishment of the network that clearly the polarization and division between East and West, but also between the North and South has increased, and that I would say does not only count for individual nation states, but also the bigger organizations working on conflict resolution, like the UN, like the EU, but also the OSCE. So certainly from a German perspective, if we look at the German media outlets these days, most of the headlines are around the delivery of tanks, how to make sure people can carry more weapons to protect themselves, or the latest pack of sanctions that may be developed for a country. So Theresa, maybe you would like to start. What changes do you observe in the ongoing global political context, and what has changed for mediation?
Thank you so much, Katrin, and everybody. And it's great to be here and very nice to be talking with Gesa in this conversation. We met yesterday online, haven't met in person, but I look forward to being able to follow up with a cup of coffee in real life in the future. First of all, just to emphasize that I left the UN last June, so I'm now an independent person. So nothing I say should be taken to reflect anything the UN thinks, because I'm out now. It's given me a bit of a chance to step back and look at the field, and some of the work I'm grappling with now is thinking about these broader questions about where mediation is and how we can take it forward across a range of actors, whether it's the multilaterals, the state level mediators, the NGO mediators, the women mediators networks like the German women mediators networks. And it is, you're right, it's an incredibly difficult moment through geopolitical polarization at multiple levels. If we look just at the last couple of years, we've had two major wars, which, and I would refer to both Ukraine and Ethiopia, which have challenged the multilateral system. I mean, challenging for the Security Council for obvious reasons, unable to grapple with Ukraine directly. I mean, endless conversations, sort of 40 or 50 meetings on Ukraine, but very not able to address it directly, and equally unable to address Ethiopia directly. And then Ethiopia also extremely problematic for the AU, able to appoint an envoy, and the deal we saw in November was the AU, but with complementary and very important engagement of Kenya and South Africa in their national capacities as well to balance things out. Both, I think, indicative of the challenges. But more broadly, we see a field of mediation where has been facing challenges due to the nature of conflict, whether it's a sense of a return of interstate conflict or the continuing prevalence of internationalized civil war with many proxies involved, which have proven extremely hard to address through mediation because of the kind of complex web of actors that are engaged with very real national interests at stake. And then when we come inside the countries where there are civil conflicts, the proxies are often related to internal fragmentation. So you have very fragmented conflicts and fairly fragmented peacemaking efforts that have all taken us away from the days of sort of comprehensive, a sort of linear process of mediation towards a comprehensive peace agreement and then an implementation of that comprehensive peace agreement. So we're looking at a very, very diffuse and complicated environment. And I think it's also important to think about, and I think that the framing of things in kind of worldview differences is helpful, because it isn't just a sort of East-West polarization, but sometimes within conflicts, there's a real gulf in terms of things like recognition of the role of the state. You see this in Islamist conflicts, and a real gulf in terms of what parties feel able to even begin talking about, because they're coming at things from a completely different worldview and point of view, which makes them feel that their goals are not negotiable. So that's I think overall it's a sobering environment. It's one in which mediators and those who work in mediation support are very busy and have a lot to contribute, but it's not easy. I can perhaps come afterwards to talk. I'm going to turn over to Gesa, but we can talk about sanctions. As somebody who works mainly on mediation, I have fairly strong views on sanctions, and woke up this morning, as most of you did, to a number of articles all over the place about how the sanctions on Russia are not working. But if you look, I'm happy to go back and look at some of the work that was done around the UN relating to sanctions and mediation a bit later in the conversation. But I'll pass over to Gesa. Yeah.
Thank you, and also from my side, very well. Welcome, and again, hello to you, Theresa. It was a great pleasure to talking to you yesterday, and I'm really looking forward to having a cup of coffee with you in person. We really should do that better sooner than later. And also hello to all our audience, and thank you for the Mediators Network for setting this up. With the broader environment and the diffuse environment you were describing, I can only agree with you, Theresa. This makes all processes very complicated, and it makes it difficult actually to bring the different tools that are there in sync with one another. And I think we all agree that mediation is a very powerful, but it's also a very specific tool. And sometimes it's difficult to say who are the parties to a conflict, as you rightly said. Well, the role of the state is questioned, so certain interlocutors you have might not speak for all parties to the conflict. And as it's about the parties, they need to decide when to bring in and decide to negotiate and to have a mediator. All conflicts we are now looking at, they will need and they will need in the future a very, very thorough analysis to really see how the different tools can actually play together and what the role of mediation is. I was actually enticed by the question, the overall question of and I was struggling with it, of our talk, because in a way it says there is a rivalry or a contradiction between mediation and systematic rivalries and sanctions and military interventions. And I would really like also to know, to learn more about your view of that, Theresa, because I think it is not, they are all tools and they have to play together in ways and in different phases of a conflict, of course also, but there is not a contradiction in it. They need to be in sync, that's what I said, but I think they can also enhance each other. Maybe not the military intervention, because the question is there space for mediation when there is still military intervention? This is also a question which I was thinking of. So I would say this is, and coming to what you already hinted at, the sanction question. Sanctions are part of the overall environment. A conflict or a mediation could take place, but it's not a tool of mediation. I would agree on that. This is probably really this is something else, because if you have the role of a mediator, you need to have the trust of the parties who decided to go into mediation. And if you have a double role, because you also have to negotiate with the ones who impose sanctions and who would be able then also to lift sanction at a certain point, this can actually interfere with your trusted position. So there is a danger for a mediator to have that. So in general, mediation should be kept separate from my point of view from sanctions. One might think of a sanctions regime that from the beginning has an element of mediation built into it. I don't know whether it will work. This is a theoretical question. I can't think of any sanctions regime where we have that, because it would need to have a mediation in there without precluding the outcome of the mediation, of course. Just saying, well, there needs to be an outcome, and the parties need to come to, with the help of a mediator, to come to a solution. So would there be a way to do that? Because I think that sanctions could be helpful in a certain way also, and can enhance mediation. But of course, sanctions, and also the second questions, sanction regimes need to be flexible, because they need to react to the progress in the mediation process and going back and forth, maybe. So this is one of the questions also from your experience. I would be curious to know more about it, because as you rightly said, our entire environment, security environment, is changing. We probably need also to be creative in the future, because the classical track one state party mediation that is, or process is facilitated by a mediator is maybe not the one we will see in the future. So what do you think about this one?
Thanks. No, thanks, Gesa. No, really, really interesting. When a few years back, I think it was a Swiss-funded effort which we really supported from the UN when I was with the UN, was research on the relationship between sanctions and mediation, which are kind of, sanctions are a very distinct, they're a diplomatic tool, and obviously this was looking in a UN context, and they have their place. And I think it depends a lot on, from a UN perspective, and where most of my work around mediation has been through the UN, or alternately through NGOs, HD Center and others, and coming from a place which puts a premium on the impartiality of the mediator, which doesn't mean being neutral in terms of violations of human rights and things, but the impartiality of the mediator and the essential relationship of trust that a mediator needs to have with the actors. And from that perspective, and the Swiss study revealed a mixed bag of things. I mean, one of the things, it cited research that actually sanctions, I think from the Targeted Sanction Consortium, had found that UN sanctions had only been effective in changing behavior 10% of the time, which is not a very great statistic. And there were some examples of processes where sanctions had they're very heavy-handed, and there it also relates to the nature of the mediator. If you have the US, I'm thinking of Dayton, the Dayton process, where you had Richard Holbrooke with a very, very assertive US power mediation, and yes, certainly sanctions affected the environment at the end of the war. Or very different example would be Sierra Leone, where you have a small, poor country where, yes, sanctions and arms embargo. And I think you can see sanctions infecting the broader environment and the kind of levers of whether it's formal sanctions or not. But one of the things that I feel very strongly is that in the UN, it can be complicated, because you have a kind of UN mediator who is representative of the Secretary General and the Secretariat, and the impartiality that the Secretary General needs to maintain is very distinct from what the Security Council might do as a separate actor composed of states. And one of the challenges that UN faces, or UN mediators faces, is often trying to explain that difference to the parties. There have been examples where UN mediators called for sanctions, but I actually think that's a real no-no in my book. I think it's a fundamental mistake, is that you need to be doing everything you can to retain access and trust of a lot of very complicated actors, whether it's military regimes or armed groups or whoever. So being seen to be calling for sanctions, I think for that kind of mediator is all wrong. It's also interesting that until there was a new sanctions regime that was introduced for Haiti just last October, with sanctions on a new sanctions regime set up and all the machinery that that implies, but with sanctions on criminal actors, this character Barbecue, who is the leader of the gangs in Haiti. But that was the first sanctions regime that the UN has imposed since 2017. There are 14 sanctions regime, but the polarization around the use of sanctions in the Security Council and the differences on it has meant there's been a real retreat away from UN sanctions. And even the Haiti regime, I mean, I've had conversations with Security Council members and none of them are that they all voted for it, which was a remarkable shift, but nobody is actually that optimistic that it's going to make a huge difference. It was really, and that is the risk of sanctions in a way, is that it's easier to do sanctions than other things. So people adopt sanctions because they don't know what else to do. And that's where sanctions come in. Just on the military dynamics, I think we have to recognize that parties enter into armed conflict because they want to win, and if they think they are going to do better on a military front, and this is very much the situation now in Ukraine, if the military dynamics are such that each side thinks it has everything to gain and everything to lose by continuing to prosecute a war, they will continue to prosecute the war. So there are lots of examples in history of the kind of that, you know, you can't bleat from sidelines. There are plenty that those thinking about mediators can do to be thinking about what a future political process might look like in anywhere that they're working, and maintaining channels and credibility. And we saw in Ukraine the very creative and significant work on the grain deal, which delivered kind of immediate public goods because of the impacts for elsewhere in the world. Also, I think built relationships and channels of communication that eventually will be helpful. But there, as elsewhere, you can't upend the military dynamics, because those are what drives the war.
No, actually, the grain deal was also something that came into my mind as a recent example where, despite the ongoing fighting, the opponents could find common ground with the help of a mediator, as it was in both their interests. I think that there is the common basis that we have seen, but it is in a way encouraging that it was possible. It is also the question, as you said, whether channels that have been established could be used at a later stage. Mm-hmm. Having said that, whenever that stage will be, needs to be decided by the parties, by no one else. So it's really in the case of Russia and Ukraine, as well as in other conflicts, the same. The question also arises, of course, what and this was the interesting part about the grain deal from my perspective as well, as there is zero trust in each other. It was still possible. So how can you mediate and how can you start a process even once the party agree, but they have zero trust into the other? They need the mediator, they want the mediator, but there is no trust. So this is also something that
I think
some are thinking about how you can build that, whether this can be done by a bottom-up approach, looking for specific local situations that you can solve. Also, given the fact what you rightly said, that there might be so many actors who are part of the conflict. So start with something, not with the big picture, but with something where you could really see that it brings a step, or it could create a step forward on a local level or between a regional level even, but not tackling the big question right in the beginning.
I think you've seen in different processes that there's that there are different levels of trust that happen at a technical level and around different issues, and as that one of the sort of characteristics of things taking time is that I'm thinking back to, I mean, it was more of a classic negotiation, but the process, the Colombia peace process with the FARC, which took time, and as in many different processes, you know, you have very opposing parties which enter into a process, and where they end up is very different from where they think they're going to end up. It involves compromise, and it involves learning along the way, and it involves developing a certain degree of trust and confidence building. And if it's in a hard military conflict sometimes, and that one was a good example, there were sort of tacit acknowledged sort of de-escalation, and whether it was agreeing on demining of a particular zone, and ways in which little by little confidence and trust could be built. Doesn't mean that there's complete trust, but it means that there's a kind of integrated web of reciprocal arrangements which recognize, but it depends on the parties, both actually or all in more complicated environments, recognizing that their interests are going to be best served by working towards peace rather than keeping fighting. I think also the issue of the way that local level processes, there are different, there's a lot of focus now on the value of local mediation, but and which arises because of the fragmentation of the conflict. And I think there are both there's a kind of intrinsic good in local processes, and as outsiders, I think we all have to be very, very careful. And again, you mentioned analysis, and it's somewhere where analysis is really is super important, because there may be local level processes which don't actually need much external support other than space or facilitation or helping with transport or conditions, because community leaders, women, others are leading, and it's very important to find the appropriate level of support. But also when you're thinking about it varies enormously because the country context is so different. Are there places where those processes can positively impact on regional or more national level processes, or is it something completely separate where you need to be finding kind of building peace up at a regional level is a big question. And then the thinking more broadly about inclusion. I mean, thinking of different frameworks and different contexts in which conversations across the divide, across the worldview differences, can be held, can be really helpful if you haven't got the space for a top level process.
No, I would fully agree. And we had, my ministry, they looked into, gender and the different instruments for foreign and security policy, and they did out an analysis, and this came out. It's recent. It was last year, 2022, and on gender and mediation. Actually, the studies show that women are still excluded to a large extent from many formal peace processes, but they often play an important role in mediating these local ceasefire agreements and local agreements, or in informal mediation. So if that between conflict parties, and very, very successfully, and as well, the studies are old that show that it's already common knowledge, more or less, that if you include women in peace processes and in mediation, the agreement in general is more stable in the end. So the question really is, how can these women and women networks that are working on in the informal space on a track 2 level or on local level then be included, that we find a process actually to have them included also in the broader process, because there apparently they still are left out. So as you said, I also said, this is an analysis is really, really important, and to see that this is really inclusive, including and taking into account all the different aspects of the conflict, and also of the need of the people to make it stable. But this is something where apparently there is still a question how to overcome that gap, that in the formal process, even with a mediator, then yeah. But your experience might be different, that they are mostly banned, at least.
No, well, I think obviously this was something that when we were at the UN, we worked a lot on, and lots of people on the call have huge expertise on this. And I think there are enormous challenges remain, but we now know that there are many different things that can be done. And the UN and other entities, the UN is one of the things that really changed in the 6 years I was at the UN was the number of women appointed to senior field positions, as well as my boss, Rosemary DiCarlo, was a woman. So at the head of the political and peace building department, but many envoys and SRSGs and women, and leading by example by governments and regional organizations is an obvious and relatively easy thing compared to the other things. I mean, one of the problems is, of course, that peace processes reflect existing power dynamics in the countries and organizations concerned. And so I always think we need to be remembering that the overall aim is for more inclusive societies. And so the work of thinking about inclusion of women in peace processes related to things like inclusion of women in elected bodies, inclusion of women in power across society. So from one of the advantages of the UN is, of course, is it engages across such a wide range of areas, and there's the work of UN Women, or from the political side, the work of the Electoral Assistance Division in terms of helping to build inclusion there. And you see, I mean, ironically, because my career began by working on the Central American processes, and first of all I was in El Salvador as a journalist, as was mentioned, where you had a number of, back in the early 90s in the negotiating delegation of the government, there were a number of very senior women because there were senior women commanders in that particular guerrilla group, and so they were there. Now, I think there are many things that if there is a sort of formal process with international actors involved, there are many things that can be done, and there's a kind of raft of different things. And we've seen experiences with women advisory boards. We've seen there are possibilities to kind of add incentives in terms of extra seats to the table. There's the developing of different channels to existing women's organizations. I mean, I think that the main thing is to kind of recognize that there are many different things that you can try and do, but that it's very different, but also keep an eye on the long term. So even if you have kind of rather short transactional ceasefire agreements that put an end to the conflict, if you've seen what's just happened in Ethiopia, then what we're now seeing, and I suspect it's indicative of other processes, and you're seeing it a bit in Sudan as well, where you're having a kind of a political agreement reached in December in Sudan, not fully inclusive of all the actors who need to be there, but continuing work to grow things outward. And I think what we are seeing now in a number of different places, Haiti would be another one, is sort of incremental processes, which are not a single big bang of an agreement, but in a way offer the possibility to keep growing and to keep broadening the base, and to keep, and that's where I think thinking in those contexts where there's a kind of constant work, thinking constantly about how to open the doors and how to open the doors to inclusion in the reconstruction and in the forward-looking process is really important, both for women and more broadly in all these contexts. The role of young people is extremely strong. Look at the youth resistance in Sudan. I mean, you're not going to have a sustainable future if you're not able to bring in the young. So I think there's this kind of more constant work about building outwards that is really, really valuable.
This is of course, apart from conflicts, also one of the work the OSCE is doing, actually, that they are trying to gender mainstream different projects, also to have more inclusive societies and to have the people in place if we're not, there is some kind of a conflict. So civil society organization for women, but not only for women, and to have a more inclusive, stable societies. This is, of course, a long process, and with backlashes, one has to. You can see that everywhere. But I think that, as you rightly said, well, it's not about the mediation and the process that leads to a ceasefire or an agreement. In the end, it's implementation, and then actually to ensure that the society is an inclusive society and that whatever is being developed actually then is sustainable, which needs to be kept. And for that, again, it's analysis that is key. And sometimes I think it's also some question of, there are some aspects where women have better access to specific needs and to specific questions and also problems. Looking at some of the underlying conflicts, underlying root causes of conflicts, there are sometimes areas where women have a specific issue. And for that, in some societies, it's only women who can actually approach them, deal with them, and try to solve these not to solve these issues, but to lead a way how they can be solved. So I think, especially for women mediators, there is a specific role to look into some areas where men most probably don't have access to, or at least it's more difficult for them.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of the work of there are different ways in, and you think of the work of I had some interaction with the Gender Commission in Colombia at an early stage where there was this sub-commission on gender, and there was a fear amongst those women at the beginning that, oh, we've just been relegated to a sub-commission on gender, rather than being at the top table. And it partly related to the FARC had a hierarchical structure, and there were 9 men at the top of it. And even though there were very strong women commanders, Victoria Sandino is very well known now, they weren't in that decision-making body. And yet over time, and with pressure from the women outside the process as well, women civil society, women victims, a wide range of women actors, they were able to have a real impact. Partly they held the pen. They were able to, and I think one of the things that's really important in these conversations, and I also think in our own kind of work as women in the field, is being awake to not just the sort of inclusion of women, but being awake to questions of women does about being awake to questions of gender. So one of the advantages of thinking about women, peace and security is it opens the doors to thinking more specifically about gender and gendered needs in a process, and which means also paying to the particular needs of young male combatants or young men in a conflict context, as well as, and it's one of the kind of real power of disaggregated data in terms of the impacts of conflict or climate change or other things on different populations, and how important that disaggregated data then is for kind of programming things. And I think, even in our own workplace, when you think about, you, I'm sure, like me, find as a relatively senior person, very senior in your case, only relatively in mine, but you find in a workplace who constantly ask for career advice by younger women and younger men, and certainly in the UN context where there's terrible, no proper mobility structure, and people who wanting to work in this field but trying to balance that with family life and other things. The difference is that the different challenges people face in navigating their institutions to pursue their career in this area, I think is a positive thing that and it's something that the women mediators networks have helped show light on. But there aren't. I feel it raised a lot of the questions without being able to provide very solid answers.
I fully agree, and as you said, it's not only younger colleagues, younger female colleagues, it's also younger male colleagues who ask this kind of advice. So society also, in our cases, it's developing, it's shifting, so priorities are also shifting, and the human resources departments, they need to also look very much to the nuances and to cope with that, so that you have teams that can deal with that, and that we have to think about the way we work, and definitely. And it's not easy, and I can understand also that for institutions and organizations, they need to deliver a certain task. And there is a limit to flexibility also, but we have to find the right balance. We have to find a way to do that. But it is interesting, it's a good development actually, that also, especially with young men, their positioning is different, or is changing, is developing with regard to family life and job. And
the risk of generalizing broadly, I think they're just
yes,
much nicer than the men. I was in the UN in the 90s, and there were lots of very nice men in the UN in the 90s, some of my friends, but the expectations of behavior, and that back then there was an assumption that the men would be able to just go off and would leave their families for larger chunks of time and things. And now I see everybody, not women obviously, but men as well, struggling with those choices and two career families and doing what lots of us have done, which is that when you're young and single, you go to the fields and you do as much as possible, and then later on it becomes much harder, but it's become harder for men. But it comes back to points about thinking about the inclusion of women in and around mediation processes, and the importance also for donors and others to recognize the value of supporting the kind of logistical infrastructure, right? In terms of women being able to travel, particularly in countries where culturally it can be harder for women to have individual agency outside family structures, and really kind of prioritizing the logistics to make it possible for women to be there, so that it isn't just a double, so that the political challenges will always be there, but thinking of ways from the outside that we can support. If the political space opens, then they're not going to be hindered by logistical, practical challenges that are relatively easy to address.
Exactly, but it's also a question of the specific society actually we're dealing with, right? So it's the different, also the obstacles might be different, but again, it would be to think about these right from the beginning, before this is starting, really to be aware that there might be obstacles, to find them, and then to find a way actually that women are not being excluded because of that, or exclude themselves. It's not being excluded. It's by default that they can't participate, and so they are out, at least.
I mean, there's been some exciting, I think we all during COVID and since, there's been some exciting developments in terms of using technology more creatively, though that you don't want it to be only through digital means, but certainly there've been good examples in Libya and Yemen and elsewhere of ways in which technology can help. Doesn't compensate, and I think obviously you need both, but I think it goes back to what I was saying, is you kind of all ideas welcome. You need it is so intrinsically difficult that you need multiple ideas, and certainly when advising UN envoys on these things, you would say you need a raft of options. That there isn't as if you do this one thing and it's going to fix it. You need to be thinking very, very creatively and constantly about the different things that can be done.
Fully agree.
Yeah, no, I think our time is about
running out. Unfortunately, but we have to continue that in person because there are a lot of more areas we could touch. But I think it is actually also to wrap it up. But in a way, it's there is a lot of space for mediation and for mediation, different forms of mediation also in this very difficult environment, I think, and this very, as you said, a diffuse environment. So we need different angles and different and be flexible and be creative if we go into that.
Wow, wonderful. This was such a rich and insightful exchange, and I grapple with the task to try to summarize this. I think you really managed in this short time period to touch on all the aspects that we wanted to be covered, and very smoothly, as if you had every other week a conversation over tea. Thank you really so much for being so open and exchanging on your experience. A few takeaways that I noted down during the conversation was really, Theresa, you mentioned in the very beginning that indeed there are challenges that have not existed in the past years for mediation before, with the return of interstate conflict and really the internationalization of civil conflict as well. But what I liked also is that you mentioned a lot of examples, and one of them being the grain deal as an example. So not everything is negative, but there are ways to still being able to mediate, at least for aspects in a process. You also touched on both of you on the role of sanctions as a tool and the challenges connected to it, the need to have them in sync with other tools and the process as such, and also the challenge if ever a mediator, as really the impartial person, uses sanctions or threatens with sanctions. I think it was interesting to listen to your examples that you had when sanctions had worked, how they were used, and what some of the challenges were also in getting them agreed upon. And then you very beautifully in your conversation touched about the topic of trust and how important it is to build trust, and some of the questions, how you build it actually, whether you can do this locally. And I think one important point that was mentioned is that even though some of the communication channels may not work at some point, they have been developed so they can be used at a later stage as well. And so the importance around that, which I thought was really insightful from your experience. Then, of course, one of the key points I think for us is to look at the inclusion of women and some of the challenges. And I would absolutely agree with both of your observations around the fact that there has been quite a bit of progress made, in particular when we look at the UN and some of the figures of SRSGs, or even deputy heads of missions, where women have played a much stronger role than they still did a decade ago. So that is excellent. But of course, it's very context driven on how they can be included. You touched, both of you, upon that as well, how the logistics have to work, and that at the basis there needs to be a really good analysis to see what is already going on and what can be supported. And I know that from my own experience that sometimes I worked with women on a very local level and they were doing mediation, but they would not call it mediation. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind as well. You mentioned the role of youth as well, and also how important it is not only for a peace agreement to have women on board, but it's laying the foundations actually for building a democracy later on, and the importance then of having women being able to be elected, being able to be in security institutions, etc. So it doesn't just stop with being part of the negotiations. And I think it was also important to see how technology has developed over time and how that opened up opportunities for more women to be included, but that this is also just one way and not the one and only solution. I think this is a great way that you ended your conversation with, this constant need really to be looking for ways of making it possible that a process is underway, and the constant creativity that is needed to ensure that mediation continues on different levels. I'm sure I missed a lot of points. I very, very much enjoyed listening to both of you, and I'm sure that all the viewers that we had felt the same. As we mentioned earlier, we would like to record, we did record this, and we would like to also have this on our YouTube channel in the future. I would like to really thank you, both of you, for making time again and for having this exchange and being very frank with your views and your experiences as well, because I think this is something we look at as well, to really hear from you, from your own personal experiences. A big thank you also to the partners that the network has, the other networks that we regularly collaborate with. We're really grateful for the support we receive, and continue following us on Twitter and on YouTube or our website or on LinkedIn, and most of all also stay tuned for more of these conversations that we're going to plan in the future. Big thank you to everybody again, and have a good rest of the day or evening.
Bye-bye.